Where do I go for this? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Very sorry for the technical delays. Rodimus has been here furiously trying to get things working, so I appreciate your patience. I'll keep this short, and actually I was just provided with an intro, so I'll just read it to you real quick. So Dr. Baker is a philosopher in cognitive science specializing in empirically informed philosophy of mind and social philosophy. The research addresses social prejudice through the interdisciplinary lenses of philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and law. Dr. Baker received their PhD in philosophy and graduate certificate in cognitive science from Rutgers University, and is currently a postdoctoral assistant professor here at Rux, as you know. I'll add to the note here that Austin's also done just an absolute phenomenal job sort of helping to shepherd our undergraduate cognitive science program kind of into being and through its growth process. And I'm really, really grateful for all of the incredible contributions you've made in that regard.
Thank you.
So with that, awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. This is really exciting. I think the last in-person talk I gave was at Rux. It was my job talk for the postdoc, and I'm about to be faculty at Oslo. So it's really nice to get to kind of end this all off with getting to chat with folks at Rux. Okay, so I'll start my timer so I don't go over. So my talk today is titled Nonverbal Marginalization, Cognitive Architecture, and Normative Harms. There it is. Nope. Okay. If it helps you and you would like to follow along, you can go to my website, austinabaker.com/Rux, and I think the slides are available there. I'm actually doing revisions on this paper, so if you want the paper, email me and I can send you what I've got, but I'm kind of in between revising parts of this paper. So as John said, I'm a philosopher and cognitive scientist. Actually, this is like a version of my job talk. So this is a little more philosophy, but there'll be some cognitive science here, and hopefully everybody will still find it exciting. But compared to the more psych talks I've given at Rux before, this maybe is a little bit different. So today I'm going to be talking about this phenomenon, which I call nonverbal marginalization, and I'm going to argue that it occurs and it's really harmful. So to be able to frame the conversation, I want to present these two different vignettes. So the first vignette takes place at some sort of corporate setting. Let's say it's like a technology company. You have these two people, Mark and Anne, who are supposed to work in the same department, and they schedule a meeting with an outside consultant. Maybe let's call him David. Look, they look so corporate, so fitting. So during the meeting, Anne notices that David seems to mostly be looking at Mark when he talks and not at her. And as a consequence of this, she feels like her presence isn't being valued. This makes her feel nervous and causes her to stumble over her words. And maybe it dissuades her from participating in the conversation as much. So the second vignette takes place at a venue that's probably familiar to all of us. So this is supposed to be an academic conference. So we have these three people, Adam, Roy, and Eric, and they're all speaking at a panel at a conference on some topic that they work on. So Adam and Roy are white and Eric is black. And during the panel, Eric notices that Adam and Roy are mostly looking and smiling and gesturing towards each other, and not really smiling as much when he talks. This makes it difficult for Eric to contribute to the conversation and also triggers his feelings of imposter syndrome as a black person in a white dominated industry. So as a consequence of this, he feels maybe kind of distracted for the rest of the conference and has difficulty focusing on his writing for a couple days. Okay, so what's going on here? So I say, firstly, both of these cases involve the distribution of nonverbal cues, right? So David is looking more at Mark than Anne. Adam and Roy are nodding and smiling mostly at each other and nod at Eric. But there isn't any explicit verbal hostility being directed at Anne and Eric, right? So Anne and Eric aren't being told that they're incompetent or unwelcome. And we might imagine that the behavior is probably non-conscious. So David, Adam, and Roy might not even be aware that their nonverbal behaviors are preferential in this way. And moreover, Anne and Eric might not even consciously register the pattern of nonverbal behavior. So they know the feeling, like Anne feels devalued, Eric feels unwelcome, but they may not realize that these feelings are being caused by their conversational interlocutors' nonverbal behaviors. But the behavior is harmful, right? So in Anne's case, her male colleagues' preferential behavior causes her to speak up less and stumble over her words. And in Eric's case, his experience triggers feelings of imposter syndrome, which causes him to disengage from the rest of the conference and maybe lose a couple days of productive writing. And hopefully I shouldn't have to tell academics in a setting like this that like a couple of days of productivity, maybe that doesn't seem that significant. But I'm going to argue that this type of harm is experienced by historically marginalized groups really often. So like women, people of color, disabled people, transgender people. So we should imagine then that the cumulative effect of experiencing this loss of a couple days of productivity, maybe every time this happens to you, is going to be really significant if it's something that happens to you regularly, which is going to be the argument. The outline of this talk is as follows. In section 1, I'm going to introduce nonverbal marginalization and talk about the cognitive architecture that supports it. In section 2, I'm going to discuss the normative harms of nonverbal marginalization, engaging in particular with these two fields of social philosophy, namely epistemic oppression and epistemic injustice. And then in section 3, I'm going to discuss the effects of nonverbal marginalization and make a few recommendations for how we can go about undermining and mitigating the behavior. So since this is a shortened version of an hour-long talk, I'm not going to go in as much depth about the recommendations, but I'm happy to pick those up in Q&A if people want to talk about them. So weird giving a talk in person. You've got to like turn away from people as you drink coffee. Okay, so section 1, nonverbal marginalization. So before getting into nonverbal marginalization, let's just take a step back and think about nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication involves the distribution of various kinds of nonverbal cues. This can include things like eye gaze, so who and what we're looking at. It can include body orientation, so having like an open versus a closed body posture. It obviously can include emotion expression, like smiling or furrowing your brow. And it can include things like gesturing, like nodding or shaking our heads. Lots to say about nonverbal communication, but it tends to be automatic and spontaneous rather than controlled. Of course, that's to say like our nonverbal communication can be controlled. So people are often motivated to adjust their nonverbal behaviors, maybe to like thinking, cohering with cultural expectations. So men feeling like they can't look sad or show distress in front of other people. But the idea is that nonverbal communication generally seems to be pretty automatic. So even when you're not thinking about it, you're using this host of nonverbal cues when you communicate with other people. And when you do, those cues are going to be registered and interpreted by the other person, which brings us to our next point. Nonverbal cues are rapidly and typically non-consciously communicated and interpreted. So the kind of traditional view people talk about in psychology is this like two-stage version of nonverbal cue transmission. So the first stage involves the generation and transmission of the cue from the one person, like you frowning. And then the second stage involves the interpretation from the other person. So like registering the frown and interpreting it in some sort of conversational or cultural context. So both of these processes are very often automatic and non-conscious. The communication and interpretation of nonverbal cues is supposed to draw on this kind of tacit implicit knowledge we all more or less have. And then nonverbal communication, a lot of people estimate, is at least as significant communicatively as the words used, if not more so. So there's been a lot of work on nonverbal communication, but thinking back to the vignettes, I want to argue that Anne and Eric are experiencing a very particular facet of nonverbal communication, which I don't think has had a lot of uptake and discussion in either the philosophical or the empirical literatures. And so this is what I call nonverbal marginalization. So nonverbal marginalization, as I define it in this project, is the behavioral tendency to distribute more positive and affirming nonverbal cues in ways that are sensitive to contextual power dynamics. So basically this means that people with more power receive comparatively more positive and affirming cues than people with less power. Couple of questions, especially if you're a philosopher, you might want to ask about this definition. It's like, okay, so firstly, what are positive and affirming nonverbal cues? I'm thinking things like smiling, nodding, positive gestures, having an open body posture, all that stuff. I don't think I really have to in this project give like an exhaustive list of what the positive cues are, but that's kind of what I have in mind. What about social power dynamics? I think this is really going to depend on the situation. So I think the relevant sense of social power could be like professional power or social power, like who's more popular or something, or attractiveness. And so whatever the relevant sense of social power is going to, in some sense, be contextually determined. And in all the cases I present, I think it's like pretty clear what the relevant sense is. Okay, so nonverbal marginalization, as I've defined it here, is tracking social power dynamics. Unfortunately, though, I argue our perceptions of social power can be influenced by our implicit or explicit social biases about historically marginalized identities like race, gender, and disability. So the claim here that I'm making in this paper, in this project, and hopefully eventually in a book, is that our biases can impact who we perceive to be socially powerful, whatever the relevant sense of social power is, and that looks really harmful. So the idea is something like men, white people, cisgender people, able-bodied people, etc., have had more social power and are thus often perceived to be more socially powerful. So we look and smile and gesture more at them. And I'm going to argue in the next section that like that might not seem that bad, but actually it's super bad if we look at the epistemic and justice literature. But I just want to flag here that even though I mostly focus on nonverbal marginalization as it relates to these historically marginalized identities, I basically think it could track any sort of power dynamic. So maybe here's one that like some of you might recognize, but you don't want to say that you recognized it. If you were unpopular in high school, you might remember, yeah, a couple of people always laugh here, what it's like to be non-verbally disregarded at a social gathering. So hopefully in your high school, no one's saying like, we hate you, we don't like you. They're not being like explicitly mean to you, but there's a kind of non-verbal disregard. Another example somebody gave after a talk was like, I don't know if you go to a conference when you're like an undergrad or a junior academic, and it just feels like senior people are kind of looking past you. So they're not being like outwardly mean to you. They're not trying to seem aggressive, but there's a sort of nonverbal disregard. So really, I just think nonverbal marginalization is tracking social power. It's just especially worrisome when the kind of power being tracked is reflecting some of these harmful social biases rooted in systemic oppression. I'm actually going to skip this section for this version of the talk. So nonverbal marginalization, the thing to say here is that it's the behavior where we look more or we smile more or gesture more at people with more social power. And I think the behavior is a reflection of underlying biases, either implicit or explicit biases. So that's what the cognitive architecture looks like. Talking to a more empirical crowd, you kind of know what these things are. I'm happy to talk more about it, but when I have an hour and I'm talking to philosophers, I like go through this in a bit more detail, but happy to talk more about it in Q&A. Look, philosophers argue about what implicit biases are. I also think it looks like it fits really nicely into philosophical accounts of microaggressions. When I talk more to feminist crowds, I like go into this more. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over it to make sure I don't go over 40 minutes. Okay, so I presented nonverbal marginalization, and I've said, or at least I've like hinted at in the next section, that it's really bad. But if it's so harmful, and I'll get to the harms in a moment, and so widespread, why do we nonverbally marginalize in the first place? So I posit the answer has something to do with the kind of importance that we place on certain sorts of social connections. So signaling affiliation with people we perceive to be socially powerful often has a lot of benefits. So we want important people to like us, so they'll promote us, so they'll befriend us, so they'll hang out with us, whatever the relevant sense is. We run into this question, how do we make powerful people like us? How do we signal our own affability to others? On the one hand, of course, signaling our own affability can be something really overt, like explicitly complimenting someone or offering to do them a favor. But nonverbal behaviors can also signal affiliation as well, like looking at someone or smiling at them or nodding towards them. And interestingly, it looks like that nonverbal signaling of affiliation seems to work, right? We like people who like at us, who look at us, who smile at us, who nod at us. And I'd say, in fact, nonverbal displays are often going to be more effective than verbal displays of affiliation, precisely because they have this element of subtlety. So maybe it seems inappropriate to just like endlessly praise your boss. So if your boss is as awesome as John McGann, you should obviously endlessly praise him. There we go. But a smile or touch on the shoulder might make them feel closer to you and might make you in turn seem more likable So that's kind of the idea. Okay, so far I've introduced nonverbal marginalization. I've hinted a bit at the cognitive architecture, saying it's the behavioral manifestation of either an implicit or explicit bias, and talked about why we might engage in nonverbal marginalization in the first place. But you might wonder now, of course, we are goodly scientists here at Rux. What's the evidence for nonverbal marginalization? I've argued it's really widespread, and I'd say probably most of you would recognize it or say that you've experienced it. Out of curiosity, for those that are comfortable, show of hands, nonverbal marginalization. Okay, there it is. Yeah, cool. Okay, so it's most people in the room. I didn't do this in my job talk, but in versions of this talk where I'm totally online, I have like a little poll, and I'm like, oh, say if you've experienced it, and then, but people at Rutgers thought maybe that looked too much like a parlor trick, but like you all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so I think even though you would say you probably experienced it and recognize what I'm talking about, a lot of you have never had an explicit conversation about it. And I'm going to argue in the next section, that's because there exists a hermeneutical deficit. So you don't have a concept to attach to your experience of nonverbal marginalization, which makes it difficult to talk about. But I think there's also lots of evidence that people are experiencing this phenomenon. So one of the best articulations of nonverbal marginalization, I think, comes from Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye. In this interaction, this is a description of a white man engaging with a Black woman where his biases are reflected in his nonverbal behaviors. So the quote goes, somewhere between retina and object, between vision and view, his eyes draw back, hesitate, and hover. At some fixed point in time and space, he senses that he need not waste the effort of a glance. He does not see her because for him, there's nothing to see. This is really like sad, but I think also a really powerful example of this phenomenon, right? So his biases against her as a Black woman are being manifested in his nonverbal behaviors. He doesn't look at her because in his mind, she, in virtue of being a Black woman, isn't socially powerful enough to warrant his glance. And so I think in the clearest way, his judgments about race and gender and power are being communicated in his nonverbal behaviors. Is there empirical evidence for nonverbal marginalization? So there certainly seems to be this connection between nonverbal communication and social power. So for example, it's been found that we look more at high power individuals when watching video recordings. We also follow the gaze of socially powerful people more and mimic high power people's smiles more. So there seems to be this relationship between nonverbal communication and social power. Though it seems important to say that these experiments aren't actually tracking nonverbal cues in real world dynamic exchanges, right? So these experimenters are eliciting one kind of nonverbal cue typically in a really artificial environment. However, nonverbal marginalization, as I'm arguing for it here, is occurring in dynamic embedded social contexts. So you want powerful people to like you. So you look at them more without even kind of thinking about it to make them like you. So if the motivation story that I've offered here is correct, and wanting powerful people to like us and wanting to signal our own affability is the motivation for nonverbal marginalization, then we should think that we probably won't be as motivated to engage in the behavior if you're just looking at somebody on a screen and the powerful person won't see you. So one thing I want to note here is that tracking nonverbal cues in dynamic exchanges, like the kinds of exchanges we should think would probably elicit nonverbal marginalization, has been just like really historically difficult and tricky to get the right kind of experimental design. But it's a tease up to something, right? So enter my collaborators and I working with machine learning. Okay, so I'm the kind of philosopher that collaborates with scientists, and we think we found a way to be able to potentially do this using machine learning to train a computer to recognize nonverbal cues. The two sets we're using are CASME2 and MMI. And the idea is that once trained, our machine learning algorithm should be able to interpret real naturalistic videos of people talking to each other and basically track the distribution of all of the nonverbal cues. So this is a task we think only a machine learning algorithm could accomplish, and we're kind of in early days with it, but really excited about it. But we think this project represents a pretty new and uncharted territory for nonverbal communication research. And I want to emphasize that we really only now are developing the kinds of technologies that are sophisticated enough to test something as kind of dynamic and social as nonverbal marginalization as I presented it here. So yay, okay. hard to give an in-person talk in a mask. I'm kind of like struggling and breathing through the mask here. Okay, so now I want to talk about nonverbal marginalization as it relates to two bodies of empirical literature from social philosophy, namely epistemic injustice and epistemic oppression. Okay, so I've talked about nonverbal marginalization. I've showed you some evidence for it. I've talked a little bit about the cognitive architecture. But I keep saying like, oh, it's so harmful, so harmful. But you might wonder, what are the harms of nonverbal marginalization? So the primary harm has to do with what Christy Dotson calls epistemic oppression. So epistemic oppression involves exclusions that produce deficiencies in social knowledge. She goes on to say that this involves an infringement on a person's epistemic agency, which is their ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources within a given epistemic community in order to participate in knowledge production. This is a kind of like big quote that social philosophers give that maybe requires a little bit of unpacking. But basically the thing that she's arguing for is that epistemic oppression involves an exclusion from epistemic affairs. And as I see it, you can be epistemically, what this means, I should say, is that you can epistemically oppress somebody, exclude them from social affairs in a couple different ways. So you can harm them in their capacity as a potential knower. So this is like harming someone in their ability to be able to ask questions and come to know for themselves. And you can also harm them as a transmitter of knowledge. So this is harming them in their ability to be able to share what they know so other people can come and learn from them in a way that is then expanding everybody's knowledge. So these are two different ways in which you can be epistemically oppressed, right? So I want to argue that nonverbal marginalization exemplifies both dimensions of epistemic oppression. So on the one hand, being nonverbally marginalized causes people to feel intimidated and dissuades them from asking questions, which prevents them obviously from gaining knowledge from their peers. So think about Anne in the meeting, like they've hired David to come in and help them revitalize their company or do whatever business people do in meetings, but because David isn't looking at her or smiling at her or gesturing towards her, she's not able to speak up and ask questions of him, so that's harming her. And on the other hand, nonverbal marginalization harms people as transmitters of knowledge as well, in that they become too intimidated to speak up and share their knowledge with their peers. So think about Eric at the conference. Because the other panelists aren't looking and smiling at him, he's not able to like share his expertise, which is why he was asked to come to the conference in the first place. And they're all being harmed because he's a good philosopher and he has things to say. So nonverbal marginalization is causing both kinds of epistemic oppression. And I think this is the kind of really primary harm of nonverbal marginalization. But it also causes, as what I call like the secondary harm, involves what Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice. So this is her second variety of epistemic injustice for people that know that literature at all. But hermeneutical injustice on her account involves having some significant area of social experience obscured from collective understanding, owing to a structural identity prejudice and a collective hermeneutical resource. That's a really famous quote. Scientists, like, if you don't know what that means, unpack it a little. So hermeneutical resource here just means the shared concepts that society generates and makes use of. So we have concepts, we are able to use them to make sense of our experience, to talk about our experiences to other people, to make sense of the world, right? So hermeneutical injustice then occurs when members of marginalized groups are preventing from creating and maintaining those shared concepts owing to some aspect of their marginalization. So this means then that the concepts which do emerge disproportionately reflect the experiences and interests of socially powerful groups. So the example of this she gives in the book is like not conceptualizing marital rape as rape for a long time to the benefit of men, because men were the ones that were in that conversation and generating that conceptual resource, and women weren't. And so the conceptual resource that emerges then serves the best interests of men. Fricker also illustrates this with a really famous example. Have y'all heard of Carmita Wood? Oh, okay, cool. Well, I mean, it's a bummer case, but it's really interesting. Carmita Wood was an office worker in the nuclear physics department in the 1960s at Cornell. So during her employment, she experienced many unwanted sexual advances from her boss. And as a result of his inappropriate behavior, her physical and mental health deteriorated and she had to quit her job. But when she was filing for unemployment, she was unable to articulate why exactly she had to leave her job at Cornell, and her unemployment claim was denied. So obviously this is a really sad story, but it has a relatively happy ending. So after hearing similar experiences from other women, Wood and other women at Cornell ended up coining the term sexual harassment to describe the pattern of behavior that they'd all experienced. And there's a really compelling point in the book where she's actually talking about the conversation that was had in the room to like sexual harassment was the term they all decided upon to describe the experience they'd all had. She also went on and founded the organization Working Women United, which introduced women to the term sexual harassment and organized for workplace protections for women. Okay, so, but taking it back to the question that I opened up this section with, what's the harm? So the primary harm Wood experiences is obviously the sexual harassment from her boss. However, Fricker argues that Wood is also harmed because, owing to this conceptual deficit, she lacked the concept necessary to make sense of her subjective experience. So she was being sexually harassed, she didn't have a concept for it, and it made her difficult to identify the experience to herself and talk about the experiences to other people. And that conceptual deficit itself is supposed to be a harm. Lacking a relevant concept for your experience due to a deficit in the shared hermeneutical resource, it's just like not having a concept for the harm happening to you, basically is what that means, makes it difficult to make sense of the experience to yourself. So like Wood, for example, initially thought that the harassment behavior was due to something she'd done or not done, which caused her to feel guilty and ashamed and isolated. So her hermeneutical marginalization, like not having the relevant concept, is preventing her from realizing that actually it was her boss's behavior that was to blame. So without the right concept, she had difficulty making sense of that experience and conceptualizing it as harm even to herself. Hermeneutical injustice also makes it difficult to communicate that experience to other people and find solidarity in their experiences, she argues. So like, how do you describe a set of experiences you don't have a concept for? It's really, really hard. And this epistemically isolates members from historically oppressed groups in a way that prevents them from finding solidarity in the common experiences of others. So while many women were experiencing sexual harassment in the 60s and certainly before then, they weren't easily able to talk about it because they lacked this relevant hermeneutical resource. Okay, so what all does this have to do with nonverbal marginalization? So I defend this claim that the lack of a concept for nonverbal marginalization is actually speaking to a hermeneutical deficit. You all know what I'm talking about. You've all experienced this, but you don't have a word for it. And so it's hard to talk about it and make sense of it. So that's part of what this project is trying to address. I'm trying to speak to that hermeneutical deficit in the POP articles for this, and I am interested in writing like articles for public consumption. It's not going to be nonverbal marginalization. The term that my team and I have come up with is probably alpha gaze. That's like the better word, but anyway, the academic version is nonverbal marginalization. Not convinced there's a hermeneutical deficit here. Contrast this with phenomenon like mansplaining or gaslighting. So those two words have emerged in the discourse over the last, I don't know, like 10 to 15 years, maybe 5 years, I don't know. So in this case, there's been a public discourse around those phenomena. So we have a hermeneutical resource for them. So we all know what mansplaining and gaslighting are, and we can identify these phenomena when they occur and talk to them about other people. But I don't think we have the relevant kind of resource for nonverbal marginalization. I think this is really difficult and isolates people. So victims of nonverbal marginalization, on my account, I think experience both dimensions of hermeneutical injustice as laid out by Fricker, right? So firstly, they experience difficulty making sense of the experiences to themselves. So it's really hard to know when nonverbal marginalization happens. People don't register the behavior or realize it's happening because they don't have a concept for it and thus aren't on the lookout for it. So like, Anne might not even realize she's being non-verbally disregarded by David in the meeting, right? She knows the feeling, she feels excluded, she feels like she isn't able to contribute to the meeting. Without the right hermeneutical resource, she really isn't in the best epistemic position to be able to identify the source of her feeling. And this is then going to make it really likely that she's going to blame herself and say, well, I guess it was my fault. I didn't speak up enough at the meeting. And I've said that to myself about this phenomenon, and I expect if you've experienced it, you have too. But you blame yourself because you don't have a concept. Victims of nonverbal marginalization also have difficulty communicating those experiences to others So without the relevant hermeneutical resource, it seems really difficult to have a conversation about nonverbal marginalization at all. So how do you call somebody out for engaging in nonverbal marginalization? For example, like, you weren't looking at me enough. It's a really hard conversation to have. And I think this is speaking to this hermeneutical deficit. I still have 12 minutes, right? Because we started late. Okay, cool. So in what I think is, I'm going to make the last section, I'm going to talk about 2 effects of nonverbal marginalization, which kind of link back up to the literature in social psychology. So the first effect has to do with imposter syndrome. So this is certainly something that's made its way into the shared hermeneutical resource. So imposter syndrome involves having negative attitudes towards oneself about one's abilities where those attitudes are false. So the idea is that people characteristically feel as if they're imposters or frauds, and this can cause people to feel isolated and isolate themselves from their professional and social communities. So you erroneously think you're incompetent, and this makes you feel like an imposter, and it makes you feel bad. That's what we're talking about. So kind of kicking it to philosophy of mind, I think, or psychology as well, I guess. This interesting cognitive architecture question arises. So like, where do imposter syndrome beliefs come from? Let's say, and this is in most of the cases we give, it's something like this, like, you know that you're great and you're so good at your job. And you have ample evidence that you're not an imposter, yet paradoxically, you think you're incompetent. What's happening here? So the first answer appeals to this sort of blameless irrationality. So you're saying like, the imposter attitudes are irrational and triggered by existent systems of oppression. So the idea is something like imposter attitudes are like psychological manifestations of biases within your culture. So you exist within a culture where you have racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. And so you, the person experiencing the imposter syndrome, is just being swayed by your awareness of the larger cultural biases, such that you aren't updating your beliefs optimally within your current environment, because again, you're supposed to have evidence that you're not an imposter. I just want to note one thing about this explanation. So this is like, I think, one of the going explanations for imposter syndrome. It isn't putting the blame on people in your immediate environment, right? So imposter syndrome is being caused by this kind of local blameless irrationality of you, but people in your environment can say, well, they've made the environment inclusive, and kind of chalk up your feelings of imposter syndrome to reflections on these obviously regrettable cultural biases. So in this explanation, it's like the imposter syndrome is being caused by society, not anything direct having to do with your environment. However, I think we have another explanation here that we can now proffer, having set up this notion of nonverbal marginalization. So if nonverbal marginalization is common and it's experienced frequently by people from historically marginalized identities, i.e. the same people that tend to experience imposter syndrome, we might think that imposter syndrome, or this is what I want to argue, I'll say, we might think that imposter syndrome is at least sometimes triggered by experience of nonverbal marginalization. What do I mean by that? What does it mean that your imposter syndrome could be triggered by nonverbal marginalization? So in particular, I'm thinking that people tend to, or might be interpreting nonverbal marginalization, like not being looked at or smiled at, etc., as evidence that they don't belong and are thus imposters. So we aren't realizing that we're nonverbally marginalizing people, but in doing so, we're giving them evidence for their own imposter syndrome. We're creating that in them. So the picture on offer is challenging this assumption that imposter syndrome at least always arises when people commit some sort of epistemic error. So people experiencing imposter syndrome, on my view, could be acting totally rationally, updating their credences according to the available evidence. It's just that their available evidence is their experiences of nonverbal marginalization, people not looking at them or smiling at them, etc., which is reflecting biased social attitudes of the people around them. But the people around them don't realize that they're giving off that evidence because their biases, many of which are implicit, are being reflected in their preferential nonverbal behaviors. So that's like one thing I think like could be going on here. In longer versions, I like connect this up to some feminism philosophy, can't hear, but okay, so I say like maybe we should at least like in part take the epistemic blame off the people experiencing the imposter syndrome. They might be justified. Catherine Hawley has a paper that argues something like this too. Maybe it's just us giving them bad evidence in part in our nonverbal behaviors. So nonverbal behavior can play a cognitive and epistemic role in supporting harmful imposter narratives And I argue that appreciating the relationship between nonverbal cues and imposter syndrome can hopefully help us develop more effective intervention strategies within our immediate environment. So one of the things I work on a lot is like, empirically and philosophically informed bias intervention strategies. And this is a place that I think we can pick that up and kind of think about it. Okay, so something else I think nonverbal marginalization can help us make sense of are performance gaps between high and low power social groups, which certainly gets discussed a lot in social psychology. So for example, there's been cited this evidence that people from high power social groups like men and white people outperform women and people of color on a number of professional and academic assessments. Now, of course, you might take methodological issue with some of that empirical work, and lots of people have, and I think those are really good arguments. But it is a big research program, and I want to talk about it a little bit. So I'll say this data often gets explained in terms of ability differences, saying like, well, maybe white people and cisgender male people are just better at math and spatial reasoning. I think that's like not a great explanation, and I'll tell you why. So I want to say that there's another way to be able to explain at least big parts of this data. So now that we have a concept for nonverbal marginalization, I want to put another kind of explanation on the table for many of these performance gaps that doesn't appeal to ability at all. Okay, so this is like the awkward example for academics. How does nonverbal marginalization contribute to performance gaps? So I think one of the best ways to illustrate this is by talking about a graduate seminar. I should say I'm not meaning to call out academics or academia in particular, but I am using a lot of academia cases because I assume they're going to be relatable to the most number of people. And maybe for a lot of people, this is like a new concept. And so I'm trying to give you examples that are going to be maximally familiar, I guess. Okay, so far, I've mostly focused on nonverbal marginalization as it affects members of oppressed groups. So nonverbal marginalization from the perspective of the people that are being nonverbally disregarded. But what about the people with more privilege who receive more of the positive and affirming nonverbal cues? I want to think about them for a second now. So let's imagine a graduate seminar where, so when the white male student talks, the faculty member and other students look at him and nod and show their agreement. So this makes the white male student feel comfortable participating in discussion and especially confident in what he's saying, causing him to genuinely seem more knowledgeable and articulate to the other students. So right, they're like nodding and smiling at him, so he feels good, so he performs better. So sorry, we're running a couple minutes late, Lauren. He seems to perform, they nod and smile at him, and so he feels good, so he contributes more, and so he feels more confident, so his words are a little more fluent, which aren't at the moment. In this way, the positive nonverbal attention he receives causes him to perform better. However, when one of the women or people of color speak up, maybe the faculty member and other students don't look at them or nod their heads as much, and this makes them feel kind of anxious and causes them to second guess the quality of their comments. So as a consequence, they contribute to the conversation less and are more likely to stumble over their words because they're kind of feeling on the spot. So that's the case that is being laid out here. So what's happening in the seminar room case? So the big thing is that there is a performance gap between the white male student and the non-white non-male students, right? So I'm building that into the case. Many times that's not the case. I'm giving you an example where I think that is the case. The white male student is contributing more than the non-white non-male students. He's stumbling over his words less, etc. But what does this say about the abilities of the students? So of course, outwardly, it's going to seem to the professor and the other students like the white male student just is more knowledgeable than his peers, right? So we might even imagine that the faculty member might be more willing to or inclined to write him a better recommendation letter, taking the performance observed in the seminar room as evidence of a genuine ability difference. And the other students might assume that he's more confident because he's speaking up more and his words are flowing more maybe, and so they're more likely to defer to his judgment more frequently. However, the performance difference on display, we know, right, isn't due to a genuine ability difference. So the white male student receives more positive and affirming nonverbal cues, so he performs better. The non-white non-male students receive fewer positive and affirming nonverbal cues, so they perform worse. But it's not that he's inherently more competent than they are, we should now be able to see that the ability difference is driven purely by a subtle climate of nonverbal marginalization within the seminar room. So another example of this for an academic case is people always say, like, you know, you report giving a better talk if people are like nodding and smiling at your talk, but if everyone's grimacing and they're on their phones, you don't report giving such a good talk. But it's not like you become a better academic or philosopher or speaker or scientist when people are like nodding and smiling at your talk. You just feel more confident, and so your words flow a little bit more, and you feel more comfortable. So anyway, your performance difference between the smiling talk and the like people on their phone talk is being driven by people's nonverbal behaviors, not some genuine ability difference on your part. So for some people's social identities, I want to argue then social identities like being white and being male and being able-bodied and being cisgendered, the world is kind of always proverbially smiling on you in some ways, and it kind of makes them perform better. And so I think sometimes we see these genuine performance gaps that aren't due to any genuine ability differences. So ability explanations for performance gaps, I think, overlook the crucial role for nonverbal behavior in facilitating skillful performances across domains. Firstly, nonverbal behavior is doing a lot to drive performance, and these kinds of ability explanations are also feeding back into oppressive social attitudes that motivate nonverbal marginalization in the first place. So I'm thinking like people think men are intellectually superior than to women, which causes them to look and smile more at men, and this causes men to perform better, which causes people to think men are more intellectually capable. So appreciating the ways nonverbal behaviors can create and maintain epistemic inequities between high and low power social groups can help us undermine the self-fulfilling prophecy potentially of these performance gaps. You know, I'm like running out of time. Really briefly, recommendations. We can identify the phenomenon. We have a word for it. We can talk about it. We can exercise conscious effort to avoid it. So this is basically the idea that nonverbal cues are often automatic, but we can decide with a bit of conscious effort to consciously regulate our nonverbal behaviors. So I want to argue here that it's within our ability and power to cultivate more equitable nonverbal behaviors. And the hope is that over time, equitable nonverbal behaviors will become more automatic to us and undermine our learned tendencies towards nonverbal marginalization. There's lots to say on that. Yeah. You can respectfully call people in that engage in the behavior. You can craft institutional policies where the behavior is explicitly discussed and addressed, which will cause people to adopt the intentional behaviors on the personal level. And then I eventually argue that this can actually be a way to erode some of those underlying biases and shape our interventions. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I know I've run out of time. So in conclusion, our nonverbal behaviors can reflect our biases in ways that are insidiously harmful, but not all is lost. We can identify this phenomenon and avow individually and collectively to cultivate more equitable nonverbal behaviors. And for the reasons I've laid out here, I hope I've convinced you that it's well worth the effort. So thank you.
Okay. Why don't we call on Karen?
Was I just called on? So, Austin, that was really thought-provoking and certainly apropos to academics. I have a question / comment. There are well-known cross-cultural differences in nonverbal behaviors. So Americans are always said to smile too much when we go to Europe. What would be considered normal eye gaze in some cultures would be considered, you know, aggressive and rude, and just the distance between that people will stand at in an elevator. You know, God forbid you said you were going to Oslo. Did I catch that correct? Yeah. Whatever you do, don't look at anyone in an elevator and stand as far apart as.
Okay, I can do that. This is gotta be writing this down.
What but given that there are these cross-cultural differences, you seem to start with the assumption that there's sort of a normative amount of for example, eye gaze, and going above that is going to be good, going below that. But given that there are these fairly well-studied cross-cultural differences, it seems that one thing that we need to be thinking about is sort of paralinguistic code switching, so to speak.
Definitely. No, I really like that point. And yeah, I, in the paper, definitely try to develop like the relevant sense of positive and affirming verbal cues is very much going to be determined, not only on the context of like who you're talking to and what the situation is, but also in the cultural context. Because as you say, there seem to be big cultural differences. Usually, I'm assuming that there's going to be a case that there are positive and affirming nonverbal cues within a culture and within a conversational context, but which ones those are and how they're utilized are going to be quite contextually dependent. So I think that is a good thing to kind of bring up. I was just using the like, oh, smiling and nodding, because those are the ones that are going to be most relatable, but I definitely agree. And the phenomenon is just supposed to track the distribution of the positive and affirming ones to covet the attention in favor of more powerful people, whatever the relevant cultural context is going to be. And I think it's going to be determined. But yeah, I'm going to email you. I would like to read some of the cross-cultural stuff to be able to appropriately build that into that empirical part of the project, because I am interested. And in our machine learning one, we are not using American data. That's Danish participants. We have the data already. So yeah, I should think about that.
With the, I guess, fairly solid finding that what's considered sort of when I'm within a culture, if a man does a certain nonverbal behavior, it's great.
Yeah.
But if a woman does the same thing,
yeah,
considered aggressive. So
yeah.
how does that get incorporated into this? So you don't, if you go outside your cultural norms as a woman, you're gonna get stomped on, right? So how do you sort of put that into the model?
Yeah, so I would think like people's intersectional identities are going to be able to build like what counts as positive and affirming. So that's going to build things in like gender and race expectations, for example, because there do seem to be big differences even within culture about how people are like allowed, almost like permitted, especially with emotion expressions. There's so much interesting work on both gender and race with emotions. But yeah, what counts as like positive and affirming is going to depend on the person's identities and who they're dealing with. So I'm not thinking it's like a one size fits all. I use the smiling and nodding examples because like it's the toy ones, but in certain contexts, yeah, like if women, you know, behaved exactly in the same emotional ways as men do, it would maybe not be seen as positive and affirming in certain circumstances because they're going with outside the kind of cultural script of nonverbal behavior. So I'm thinking it's supposed to like build all of those in. The relevant sense of cultural context and the relevant sense of positive and affirming is going to depend on your culture, but then also your intersectional identity, building things in like race and gender within the context. And I think you need to build those constraints into the model, but we do often know when we're talking to someone like what, you know, given keeping representations in mind about social facets of them, like how to interpret those cues. And so I think we're doing subpersonal computations of all of those different things when we're interpreting people's nonverbal behaviors. But I definitely think I want to build those in, and I think I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes. Oh wait, do you want to comment? Sorry, we've got people on the thing, so yes, come on up. This is a perspective philosophy student asking a question.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Hi, anywho, I totally understand this this call to regulate our nonverbal behavior to be more positive, and like be conscious of that and conscious of how we kind of intersectionality kind of works with that. I'm kind of wondering, like, how does this work with, are we also supposed to maybe like stop smiling and nodding at like people in certain positions of power? And like, how does that work? Because I think on like one hand, like I'm like, oh, you know, maybe this would be a good idea. But I also think about like like safety issues, but I also think about like, is that like going to end up backfiring in some sort of like important way? And I was wondering if like you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So at the moment, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So at the moment, I think the recommendation, and I kind of get into this in the longer versions of this presentation, is it something like being aware of how you're distributing nonverbal cues, and it's kind of being flexible. So in certain circumstances, especially if you're the low power person, it's like, well, do I not smile at my boss? Like that's going to harm me even more. Like I'm being marginalized structurally, and then I'm supposed to. So like, I don't think that's always the ask, but I think one thing that I started working on this stuff at Johns Hopkins when I was like thinking about this, and everyone had these conversations of like, whoa, we've all experienced this thing. This is super weird. Faculty sometimes do this. And so we all decided collectively, it sounds really basic, but it's like, we're going to be aware of this. We're going to be more consciously monitoring our nonverbal behaviors and exchanges and just like try to do better. And it sounds really like basic and kind of trite, but it's the kind of thing, and this is something I endorse in the paper, but I think you can start making, and I link this up to the implicit bias intervention stuff, but really like deliberatively trying to smile and look at everyone and really keep it in your mind. And then those more equitable behaviors like do become easier over time. It seems awkward at first when you're forcing yourself to like make sure you're looking at everyone in the meeting. And I say we all do nonverbal marginalization. We do this a lot. I think everybody does it. But it's something that gets easier when you start like working on it and kind of regulating it. So the ask at the moment is just like, be aware of this behavior, be aware of how it can drive other people's behaviors, and it can like reinforce privileges in ways that we're not even on the lookout for. And then also within your own behavior when you're interacting professionally or socially with people, try to be mindful of your nonverbal behaviors. And we were all so surprised. It's like really basic, but within a few months, we all thought we had gotten significantly better at this. And even though this is non-conscious and subpersonal, I think like you can form the conscious level intentions and form better habits. So that's the ask at the moment, but it's not like, oh, you can never like look at powerful people, because I think that is like really unfair responsibility put on someone. Yeah, great question though. Yeah, go for it. Oh yeah, go for it. Smile at John.
Hi.
Smile at John.
So my question kind of follows on Karen's. It's related to sort of two thoughts. One is about domains, right? So thinking back to the high school example you used once upon a time, right? There were certainly students in my high school that were sort of marginalized in the hallways, but not in the classrooms, right? And I see a lot of, it's almost like code switching in different sort of subcultural environments. The way you interact with people at the gym is maybe different than whatever. And that's leading me to a question that's ultimately about nonverbal, but not necessarily physical versus non-physical marginalization, right? If you watch a basketball game, there are some studies of the NBA at one point of how often do players touch each other, right? There was an amazing fact that Kevin Garnett, very great teammate, he after a free throw, he typically touched all 4 teammates within 600 milliseconds, right?
Whoa.
It was just, that was how it worked. And there's
Face or like what?
no, like, you know, quick, quick hand touching, you know, that kind of stuff. So there, basically, I'm kind of wondering how your thoughts extend to nonverbal but physical interactions, which can be both the negative shove in the hallway in high school and the positive, you know, hey man in the gym.
Yes.
I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, definitely. So as nonverbal communication, as I've defined it here, is supposed to like, it's not just like non-physical. So it's anything that's not spoken. One facet that I think your question brings out, which I don't talk about here, but I really want to think about, is like nonverbal marginalization, as I've defined it, is like the tendency to attribute more positive and affirming nonverbal cues. So that can be like, you know, the nodding and the smiling and the touching on the arm or something. But as has been pointed out to this, like they're also negative nonverbal cues. I don't talk about those at all, but like shoving and like, you know, grimacing and all of those kinds of things. Like, it's not just like, oh, you smile more at some people, but some people you're like actively negative towards. And in work that I talk a little bit about the cognitive architecture, I basically argue that I think when it's manifesting an implicit bias, it's probably more like the lacking of the positive cues. And when it's manifesting an explicit bias, like you explicitly don't like some group and you're using nonverbal marginalization as a way to like shut the woman or person of color out of the conversation, if you're really explicitly biased against them, it's going to be something that's the explicit negative nonverbal cues, not just the lack of positive nonverbal cues. In the talk, I mostly focus on the lack of positive nonverbal cues, because I think like where nonverbal marginalization manifests for like hopefully most of us or like many of us is the more like subtle. It's just like, oh, the slight difference in the distribution of the smiling and the nodding actually has big differences in performance and big differences in who's able to contribute to the conversation and who's getting taken seriously. And it has like all these downstream things. But I think it's important to think about explicitly negative nonverbal cues too. And I think it often gets reflected of explicit bias, and that's just like a different kind of cognitive architecture story to be told about how it's manifesting the behavior. But I also think it's important, and I mostly focus on implicit stuff. But yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think the negative nonverbal cues have to be talked about too. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Maybe a little bit drier. But you had mentioned sort of 2 competing models about imposter syndrome.
Yes.
One about maybe we're irrationally updating our sense of our own competence, and the other is maybe it's actually very rational because you're taking into account all these nonverbal cues. But I feel like two accounts may not actually be at odds with each other, because the nonverbal cues you're getting from other people are from biases that are not a good indication of your competence. So updating, like me updating my sense of my own competence based on your facial expression right now,
Mhm.
like by what I'm saying right now, maybe I'm saying something very stupid.
No, no.
But, right, but
Sorry,
that's the thing is that like your micro expressions aren't necessarily indicative of my competence, because they're based on all this other stuff that's very hard to be cognizant of. So on some level, it is still kind of irrational for me to update my sense of my competence based on other people's prejudice or other people's implicit biases, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're like a member of a marginalized group, you have an entire lifetime of people like giving you negative cues, so
Right.
it's kind of hard to pull apart.
Sure.
The claim is more like, do you have any evidence of your like immediate environment supporting an imposter narrative? And the argument, the kind of traditional argument is like, no, everyone in you're like, you should know that you're awesome and competent. It's just like the world makes you remember that you're a member of a marginalized group, and so you're kind of down on your own ability. And my thought here is like, well, it may not even need to be as grandiose for some of the reasons you're talking about. My thought is that maybe other people, well-meaning people around you, are actually providing you with evidence for the imposter belief that you're picking up on. Maybe you think like, oh, this meeting is so like good and inclusive and we're doing all these things, but maybe they're giving you all of these like negative micro cues. You're picking up on those, and that's what's making you feel so crappy. So it's not like, oh, you know, how are you feeling crappy in this meeting? Like maybe other people are reflecting their biases and their nonverbal behavior, and they're more directly causally implicated in your manifestation of imposter syndrome and that belief than you might have originally thought. That's the idea.
Yeah, okay. I guess, yeah, I saw it too as being sort of like, this is a good explanation of what's like, it's a better explanation of what that one was maybe trying to say in the first place, which is you're maybe misweighting cues or misattributing.
But it's about the evidence. People are
Right.
giving you evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the point. Yeah,
Right.
it's like your people around you are giving you nonverbal evidence, which you're updating on
Right.
locally updating, and so there's a local rationality there, which
Right.
is supposed to be local irrationality. This is like getting into like more epistemology, so like
Right,
isn't
okay.
relevant to this. But like
Yes.
there's more local rationality than like we would normally model your epistemic behavior. Or
Okay.
opposites.
Yeah, I guess I was missing from that first model is whether it denies that level of like local rationality, updating from some kind of evidence, but just maybe it not being like a very appropriate piece of evidence, which you can't know.
Yeah, and it's complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Austin.
Yeah.
How long do we need to set up for our next speaker? A couple of minutes? Okay, sorry, since we got off to a late start, we're running a little bit behind, but thanks, everybody. We're going to have a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we're going to come back on with Jane Lipton.